The fall of the House of Kildare is a story fraught with intrigue and underhanded dealings, as well as huge battles that demonstrated to early modern Ireland the kind of destruction that a well-armed and equipped army could unleash on an unprepared countryside. Back then, just as it is today, Ireland was a fringe nation on the edge of Europe. The innovations of the Renaissance period were slow to reach Ireland, and many of the powerful figures in the island's history during the period exhibit traits and behaviours which indicate that their mindset was still stuck firmly in the medieval period. This inability to keep up with the times proved to be a serious disadvantage to several Irish rebellions, though the lesson was eventually learned through repetition over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Fitzgerald family, lords of Kildare since the Anglo-Norman invasion in the middle of the 12th century, are a textbook example of the stubborn thinking of Gaelic Ireland. Despite the famous diplomatic abilities of Garret and Gerald Fitzgerald, the family would eventually be deposed from the great heights of power and influence that they had obtained, largely due to their inability to sense where the wind was blowing. Before I get into the Fitzgerald family's steps onto the ladder of power, let me set the scene for you. Ireland in the late 15th to early 16th century is a borderline autonomous kingdom. Nearly all the earldoms and chiefdoms on the island are ruled by Anglo-Norman and Gaelic Irish lords, who pay varying degrees of attention to King Henry VII across the Channel. The only place in Ireland with territory directly administered by the English throne is centred around a region called the Pale. This region was centred around Dublin and its neighbouring counties. In between the Pale and the territory under control by the Gaelic Irish was an area called the Marches, or the Marcher territories. These lands were named for the way their inhabitants could march back and forth between the English and Irish spheres of influence. The Marcher lords walked a fine line between fealty to the English crown and autonomy. Kildare sits right on the edge of the Pale's borders, close neighbours with the Marcher territories, and through them, the untamed Gaelic lordships. This is where Garret Fitzgerald, the 8th Earl of Kildare, enters the story. He managed to make his way into the good graces of King Henry VII at a time when the king was looking for a loyal servant to fill a position of great importance. That position was the Lord Deputyship of Ireland, de facto ruler of the island in the name of King Henry VII. But hold on, why would Henry willingly give away direct control of his own territories in Ireland to an Earl in Kildare? Doesn't make much sense, but some context will probably help. If you're at all interested in the history of England, you'll be familiar with the near constant state of war between England and France, the so-called Old Enemy. The years of ever-present warfare had left the English crown almost destitute. Regardless of the English financial situation, control had to be maintained on the English territory and loyal lords in wider Ireland. There was just one small problem. Maintaining a standing army in Ireland was a huge drain on the English treasury. It simply wasn't economical to have troops there all the time, just in case a rebellion might start. The solution was to rule indirectly through a Lord Deputy. Garret Fitzgerald had earned the confidence of Henry VII through a battle he was involved in against Gaelic Irish lords. Henry could have chosen a native Englishman as Lord Deputy. An English candidate would no doubt have been easier to steer and ensure loyalty from. However, an English deputy would not have had the connections and innate understanding of Gaelic Irish politics that an Anglo-Norman lord like Garret did. Knowing this, Henry chose to make Garret Lord Deputy in 1496, pushing Ireland into a new era at the close of the 15th century. As Lord Deputy, Garret effectively ruled Ireland in the name of King Henry VII. Henry knew the risks, but he was willing to accept them in return for a quiet Ireland. The deputyship conferred many benefits onto the House of Kildare, and firmly pushed it into the ascendancy. Garret was afforded the right to appoint his own choices to many of the main state offices in the administration of Ireland. Only the position of Chancellor remained Henry's alone. Furthermore, all the revenues collected from Ireland passed through the Kildare coffers. Garret was expected to use this money to develop the Lordship of Ireland. Naturally, however, a fair amount of that money enriched Kildare himself. In return for this privilege, Garrett was expected to defend Ireland from potential threats, both within and without. To his credit, Garrett did exactly that for 17 years. During his career, he embarked on 15 different campaigns to put down various rebellions and disgruntled Gaelic Irish lords. Garrett's duty took him to each of Ireland's provinces, some of which had not seen the presence of troops loyal to the English crown for almost a century. Despite Garrett's obvious enthusiasm for going out on campaign, most of the time he had no real need to. He maintained order in Ireland by offering protection to the Gaelic Irish chieftains against their rivals in exchange for peace and taxation. This taxation came in many shapes and sizes, and was not always conventional in nature. The various lords of Gaelic Ireland were of widely varying means, and knowing this, Garrett decided to implement a system in which each lord was charged according to how much he was able to give in exchange for protection. For example, Lord O'Dwyer of Kilmanagh was obliged to deliver a nest of goshawks annually, rather than an exact amount of money, or something else of similarly concrete value. Lords who were known to have greater resources were charged accordingly. Take Lord O'Farrell, who had to pay a yearly tax, support a battalion of gallowglasses from Kildare for a quarter of the year, and attend Garrett for military tasks when called for. This sounds like it would be a recipe to breed resentment among the Gaelic Irish lords, but in actual fact it seems to have worked rather well. Slowly but surely, over the course of 17 years, Garrett took on many of the responsibilities and privileges of feudal overlord in Ireland. Colm Lennon put it very well in his book 16th Century Ireland, when he wrote that the Fitzgeralds had all the trappings of royalty in the Gaelic sphere. Towards the end of his tenure as Lord Deputy, Garrett acquired the moniker the Uncrowned King of Ireland in some circles. Whether or not King Henry knew about these rumblings, or whether he was even aware of just how powerful Garrett had become during his long period in office, is up for debate. However, it is ultimately irrelevant, as in 1513 Garrett was mortally wounded while on a punitive expedition against the O'Carrolls. He was ambushed by enemy soldiers while watering his horse, and only narrowly escaped. Soon after, he arrived home in Kildare and succumbed to his wounds. It is interesting to consider where Garrett's path might have taken him had he not been wounded by that river in 1513. He was not known to be a plotter, and generally conducted all his dealings out in the open. But kingship is a tempting prospect. Regardless, Garrett left the stage, and his son Garrett Oge, literally meaning young or little Garrett, took over as the head of the Fitzgerald family. Garrett Oge was a very different sort of man to his father. Often going by Gerald rather than his father's namesake, Gerald was more diplomat than soldier, and was known to be something of a schemer. The office of Lord Deputy did not fall automatically to Gerald, but it was ultimately awarded to him, largely for the same reason that it had been awarded to Garrett Fitzgerald by Henry VII. Henry VIII knew that a good Lord Deputy needed an intimate understanding of local politics and the connections to take advantage of that knowledge and use it for the benefit of England. I think it's fair to say that Henry VIII, who took the throne in 1509, would have preferred not to place Gerald in the role of Lord Deputy. He knew that Gerald was a canny man who was inclined towards factionalism and feuding. Indeed, under Gerald's leadership, the Fitzgerald family revived the feud between it and the Butler family, a feud which his father Garrett had put to rest in his lifetime. His misgivings aside, though, Henry understood that Gerald was a man who could be English one day and Irish the next. This trait was essential for the position of Lord Deputy. Thus, soon after the death of his father, Gerald inherited both the county of Kildare and the office of Lord Deputy. Gerald was a man who knew how to get what he wanted. At times when he felt his position and influence were not being respected by the English administration, he would surreptitiously contact his cousins outside the Pale to let them know that open season had begun on English land. He would make only token attempts to stop them from raiding and pillaging for profit. When he felt the danger to his status had passed, Gerald would clamp down on the raids again, and peace would resume. Through this practice, he made himself appear indispensable in the eyes of the English. Gerald's underhanded dealings were not to last, however. By the time he was Lord Deputy, England was finally beginning to get back on its feet, following the devastating civil war, the War of the Roses, which had ended in 1485. As England became more and more stable, King Henry and his administrators were able to turn more of their attention towards Ireland, and scrutiny fell on Gerald's management practices. It was around this time that complaints began to emerge from prominent noblemen within the Pale regarding the unfair political hegemony that the Fitzgerald family sat at the head of in Ireland. A common theme that emerged in these complaints was that Gerald exercised a hugely disproportionate amount of power, even considering the office he occupied. This was what first drew suspicion upon Gerald and his family from Henry VIII. Until that point, Henry, and his father before him, had been willing to overlook the growing power of the Fitzgerald family in exchange for a relatively quiet and inexpensive Ireland. Now, however, Henry worried that through inaction, he had inadvertently allowed a potential rival to accrue power to himself. The English grip on Ireland was still extremely tenuous during this period. The famous Tudor reconquest had not yet taken place, and all it would take was a spark to set the whole island ablaze. Given the information that had just come to light in the complaints levelled against him, Gerald decided upon what, with the benefit of hindsight, was probably the worst thing he could have done. He embarked on a number of rather suspicious activities, chief of which was moving artillery out of Dublin Castle and into some of his own castles in Kildare territory. This in itself was not unusual, as it was Gerald's right to reposition state assets in Ireland as he saw fit, in order to assure the island's defence. However, the timing could not have been worse. Gerald made himself appear a guilty man in the eyes of Henry, and soon after the movement of the artillery, he received a letter from the court of the king that demanded he come to England at once. Gerald's excuse for moving the artillery had been rumoured trouble in the Marcher territories, but this explanation had clearly not flown with Henry. Quite understandably, Gerald was of the opinion that a trip to England at this particularly delicate time could prove hazardous to his health. He put off going for as long as he could, claiming that he needed to recover from a wound he had recently received. A follow-up letter came from the King's Court, demanding that Gerald come across the Channel regardless, but also that he could name a Lord Deputy in his absence. Finding these terms acceptable, Gerald designated his son Thomas as Lord Deputy. Thomas Fitzgerald is the last player to enter this story, and his role is a somewhat tragic one. He was often better known as Silken Thomas, for the way he made his men wear expensive silk headscarves around their helmets. Only 21 years of age when he took the deputyship, Thomas could not have predicted how many people there were out there who would like nothing more than the end of the Fitzgerald line. Regardless, he stepped up to the role of administering Ireland in the King's name, and his father Gerald sailed across the Channel to England. Gerald had been summoned before the king before on less serious occasions to defend himself over more minor offences, and escaped unharmed. So perhaps he felt that he could talk his way out of difficulty in this situation as well. Unfortunately for him, it didn't turn out that way. Soon after his arrival and initial questioning, Gerald was arrested on suspicion of treason and imprisoned pending further trial. To make matters worse, somebody, it is not known exactly who, forged a letter and had it sent to Thomas Fitzgerald back in Ireland, who was eagerly awaiting news of his father. The letter claimed that Gerald had been imprisoned and subsequently executed in the Tower of London. This was of course false, but Thomas had no way of knowing, and he reacted just as the sender of the letter likely hoped he would. In 1534, he raised his banner in rebellion. Distraught at the news of his father's death, Thomas gathered his troops to and marched to Mary's Abbey, where the Privy Council was conducting a meeting. Bursting through the door, Thomas threw down the sword of state on the table and announced, "I am no longer Henry Tudor's deputy. I am his foe." Casting down the sword of state on the table was a significant gesture, and it no doubt appealed to the young Thomas due to its dramatic flair. Traditionally, casting your sword at the feet of your king is a declaration of intent. The intent, of course, being to rebel. Given that Henry VIII was across the sea, his administrators were the next best thing. This ceremonial action is also significant because it tells us a lot about Thomas's mindset, and by extension, the mindset of many other Anglo-Norman lords. The casting down of the sword was commonly practiced in the medieval period, but had fallen out of relevancy as the early modern period began to roll onward. It speaks to a wider implication in relation to Ireland itself, in that it was behind the times and had not caught up on a changing relationship between king and vassal. Feudalism was rapidly becoming a thing of the past. Moving swiftly on before we get too sidetracked, no sooner had Thomas cut ties with Henry VIII, news reached him that his father was actually very much alive and most likely aghast at Thomas's course of action. No doubt Thomas would have wished to take back his words, but that was impossible now, for better or for worse. Thomas was now committed to this new course. Wasting no time, Thomas gathered his troops and marched on Dublin, the core stronghold of English dominion in Ireland. Hoping to gather support from other Irish lords, and perhaps even from foreign kings, Thomas called his rebellion a Catholic crusade. This did not work out from the way he wanted to, however, as at the time Ireland did not have nearly as much of a tradition of Catholicism as it would come to have in later centuries. Even if it had, the Crusade designation would have been no help due to the murder of Archbishop Alan after the siege of Dublin began. Alan was a foe of the Geraldine family, who the Fitzgeralds are a branch of. Knowing how much danger he was in, Alan had attempted to flee the city by boat, but was driven ashore and executed by Thomas's men. The excommunication was a serious blow, but Thomas pressed on and called for the Lords of the Pale to join him in the siege of Dublin. Some chose to do so, but others refused and were imprisoned by Thomas at his castle in Maynooth. Rapidly becoming more extreme in his policies, Thomas announced that he would exile or put to death anyone found to have been born in England. By July of 1534, Thomas judged that waiting any longer was to invite retribution in the form of an expedition from England. He ordered an assault on the walls of Dublin Castle. An outright assault is a desperate gamble in any siege, and unfortunately for Thomas, it was disastrous. His army was routed, and Thomas chose to retreat to his stronghold in Maynooth to await the retribution from England that would surely come. That retribution did come in 1535, when Sir William Skeffington arrived with a small but very well-equipped and well-trained force to punish Thomas. Thomas waited for Skeffington at his castle in Maynooth, confident that he could hold out in the castle just as the English had done in Dublin. However, in yet another instance of tragically poor timing, the castle was betrayed to Skeffington in March of 1535, while Thomas was away, gathering support to reinforce it. All it had taken was a bribed guard to open the gates to Skeffington's men, and the siege was over. The entire garrison was put to the sword in what became known as the Maynooth Pardon. The capture of Maynooth was one blow too many for Thomas and his rapidly diminishing supporters. He petitioned Lord Leonard Grey, who by this point was the new Lord Deputy, for peace and pardon for his offences. The English crown was still desperate to avoid unnecessary spending, and knew that Thomas still had the strength to be a costly and painful thorn in its side for some time to come yet. Lord Grey guaranteed the personal safety of Thomas and persuaded him to come to England and throw himself upon King Henry VIII's mercy. Looking back on Henry with what we know now, asking him for mercy was probably a poor choice, but Thomas was desperate. In October 1535, he was sent as a prisoner to the Tower of London. His father Gerald was at this point truly dead and had succumbed to an illness in late 1534. Thomas lived on in prison until February 1537, when he and his 5 uncles were unceremoniously executed at Tyburn. His uncles were hung, drawn and quartered, but Thomas was at least granted the dignity of being beheaded and buried. He was little more than a boy when he died, but his rebellion had far-reaching implications despite being an abject failure. In many ways, it began the slow slide into decline for Gaelic Ireland, as it was followed by the 60-year Tudor reconquest of Ireland, which endeavoured to disempower the Gaelic Irish lords and pacify the countryside. Thomas's rebellion was insignificant in scale when compared to those that came after, such as the rebellion of Hugh O'Neill, but it is important, as it was the start of a process. The process was one of reluctant modernisation, as Ireland was dragged, sometimes kicking and screaming, other times willingly, into the early modern period. The breaking down of overly powerful lords such as the Fitzgerald was a necessary act, as it opened the way for the construction of a modern nation-state. Such lofty concepts as nation-states and patriotism were a long way off yet for Ireland, and indeed were not yet fully formed on continental Europe, but the foundations were most definitely being laid. I hope you enjoyed my telling of the fall of the House of Kildare. I've definitely enjoyed researching and writing for it. So if you have any questions, or better yet corrections on any info that I touched on during the video, please don't hesitate to contact me at KeanRowanYT, that's YouTube, at gmail.com. I will endeavour to have them cleaned up as soon as I can. Feel free to leave a comment on the video, as I'd love to have a discussion on the topic. And as an aside, I'd like to direct anyone who is listening to my blog at www.irishhistoricalstudies.blogspot.com, where you'll find entries on things that I wanted to talk more about in my videos, but had to cut short for the sake of flow. If that sounds like something you'd like, then head over and leave me a comment. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.